Okay, it's 1 o'clock, and although I assume that people will still be joining us in the coming minutes, I propose that we start. So welcome to this session on artful participation, doing artistic research with symphonic music audiences, which is actually the title of a 4-year project that we did in the MCICM starting in 2017. We thought this symposium would be a good moment to share our work and our findings with you. And we will do so by 2 presentations and hopefully a discussion. Presentations by Veerle Spronk, who has been the PhD researcher on the project, and also Ties van der Werf, who has been a postdoc on the project. And just 1 sentence more, Veerle, because before I pass on to you, the whole idea behind the project was to combine academic research with practice-based artistic research. And yeah, Veerle will probably be talking more about the academic side of things, where Ties is going to talk about the various experiments and activities that we organized in the project. Maybe just one last remark to those of you who were not here during the opening panel debate. Really great that you're here. Our experience in the previous session was that, of course, you can have comments in the chat, but if you have questions, the group of people is small enough that you can use the raise hand function, which makes it a little bit easier for me to moderate the discussion. But that doesn't say that you shouldn't use the chat, of course. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Veerle Spronk.
Thank you, Peter. I'll share some screens. Let me see. There we go. That should work, right? All right. Thank you, Peter, for introducing our project, because Peter was also part of this project, of course. And Ties and I will be talking about the project that we were part of, but that also Peter was part of, Ruud Benschop was part of, and Imogen Eve, who I also actually saw in the room, was also part of. I'll introduce that a bit further. Ties and I will present right after each other. So we'll do the whole presentation and then have time for questions. So we won't have the questions in between our talk, because we're going to give you an overview of the project as a whole. So very short recap. The project that we're talking about, as Peter already said, was a project which combined academic and artistic research. And it was a collaboration, as the MCICM is, between Maastricht University, between the Zuid University of Applied Sciences, and then in particular the Research Center of Arts, Autonomy and the Public Sphere, and the Conservatory of Maastricht, and the Philharmonic Zuid-Nederland. And it ran for the past 4 years. That means it started in September 2017 with me commencing the PhD. And then in 3 parts, the whole project sort of came together. And now I think we're only waiting for the final thing, which is my PhD defense, which will be in July. So then the project will be completely finished off. So just for your understanding, it was a project that was built up in 3 parts. And you will hear a bit about each of these parts. So the first part, so what started in September 17, was an empirical research project on the current symphonic landscape, on this topic of audience participation, the innovation of audience participation. I will tell you more about that in a second. So I started as PhD candidate ethnographically examining what was already going on in Dutch symphonic practices, to learn from the problems, the tensions, but also the opportunities that were there. Then as a second part, and this started to overlap each other, it kind of built up on top of each other. The second part were that led by postdoc Ties, who will talk after me, and musician researcher Imogen Eve, And together with the musicians and participants, I see people entering this space. So together with the practitioners of Philharmonie Zuid-Nederland, they developed and actually conducted and performed concert experiments in the practice of the orchestra, just to also change the role of the audience and to monitor what it meant to experiment in practice of an orchestra. Thies will tell you more about that. And then finally, in a third phase in the last year, during the lockdowns in 2021, actually, we worked together, again, everyone, so from the hogeschool, from the university, and from the orchestra, in developing a learning model. So what have we now learned about how orchestras can change, can innovate their practices, and how can we make that learning more structural? So how to keep learning also after the project ended. That's where this presentation will end this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to start with telling you a bit more about my PhD research, which is entitled Listen Closely, Innovating Audience Participation in Symphonic Music. And as I said, it's a qualitative empirical research into orchestral practices. And it focuses on the Netherlands, because as in many Western countries, but now focusing on the Dutch landscape, the relationships between symphony orchestras and their audiences have been critically questioned more and more over the past 20 years. So there is said to be too little audience, and the audience that does exist is too uniform, so too old, too wide, too highly educated. These are all assumptions, but they inform orchestral practices at this point, because the sort of the general idea that lives in also public debates about the arts and about classical music is that the roots of this problem would be the role of the audience as attentive listeners in silence. This role would no longer fit with today's sort of experience society. So it would better be changed. It would better be experimented with by symphony orchestras. That's the assumption. And it's not only an assumption, but because sort of responding to such discussions and responding to measures taken by the government and by cultural policy to actually encourage orchestras to start to experiment with audience participation, every professional Dutch symphony orchestra has, in one way or another, started to experiment with audience participation. And by doing so, they relate to this quest from public discourse and from cultural policy, but at the same time, they also still relate to their identity as artistic organization. So the music that is played, and we already kind of heard that in the opening panel, that there's tensions there. So the music that's played must continue to be played well. But what does that mean when you change the concert, when you change the role of the audience? So at the same time, orchestras are concerned with relating better to the 21st century society. But on the other hand, they are concerned with still providing aesthetic quality. So still keeping up these high standards that they have had for so long. That is quite a puzzle. And this balancing act, these tensions, they formed the puzzle that was central to my PhD research. And what is striking is that in much of the existing debates and much of the existing research, aesthetic quality and social or societal relevance are often implicitly assumed as two separate domains or separate areas that also oppose each other. So that means that concerts are evaluated either according to aesthetic criteria or to social criteria. And if you have a look at historical studies of attentive listening, then you soon come to understand that this divide between aesthetic and social is problematic, but that it's also understandable from a historical perspective, because many of the rituals of symphonic concerts exist because they are a familiar way to achieve an aesthetically good concert. They are ways that have worked for quite some time. Actually, since 1800, as philosopher Lydia Gür famously describes in her book, sort of the practice of symphony orchestras has been organized and structured, regulated by a work concept, by the idea that pieces of music exist as autonomous artworks that can be performed, that can be listened to, that can be composed. And this installs a sort of idea of there being an aesthetic core that can be protected, and that there's social practices around it. So you can already see that sort of dualistic understanding of social versus aesthetic there in these historical traces. However, if you look closely at it, what becomes clear is that, in fact, the two are completely intertwined. God, I keep getting distracted by messages. I should see if I can switch it off. Anyhow, I'm just going to continue. What I was saying was that that in fact, so the social rituals of attentive listening are in place because they contribute to a particular aesthetic ideal. So if you change the role of an audience as attentive listener, you will also have to look at the aesthetic quality and how you define and understand that, the aesthetic standards that have been taken for granted. So the moment that the traditional role of the audience is being innovated, all kinds of things start to shift, all kinds of standard criteria are at stake. But what exactly happened? Happens when these things are changed, and how things start to shift when audience participation is being innovated, that has been little researched. So that's why the main question of my research was the following. So how do, very practical, practice-oriented, how do Dutch symphony orchestras innovate audience participation in their everyday practices? Really looking at this practical work. And how are, at the same time, norms and values, so this existing aesthetic framework, how is that challenged as well as emergent in the process of doing so? So in order to answer that question, I went to look in orchestral practice, but I didn't start immediately at the orchestra's work floor. My empirical research actually started in another practice that is closely linked to the work orchestras do, namely the practice of cultural policymakers. So cultural policy is the world that is often argued to be the world in which the notion of participation has its origin, finds its roots. And in fact, if you look at the Dutch landscape, ever since 1999, oh, why don't you come? Ever since 1999, participation, the word participation, participatie, has played a central role in all the documents that have been published by the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, as well as the Dutch National Advisory Council, the Council for Culture. In each of them, ever since that time, the word is used, plays a central role, becomes one of the criteria on which cultural projects are evaluated. But what I saw when I traced and analyzed the definitions that emerged from this notion of participation was that this definition also continuously changed. It was a moving target, so to say. So I conducted a discourse analysis not with the aim of ending up with the definition of participation to make things crystal clear. Rather, I wanted to understand what kind of problem space there was. So what kind of notion is participation? What does it do? What does it problematize? But also what kind of space, what kind of playing field does it create for cultural institutions? And what I found was that the centrality of the notion of participation can be explained if you look at the tensions that historically underlie Dutch cultural policy, because Dutch cultural policy is built on a principle that the Dutch people here will probably know, but the others won't, so I'll explain it. This principle is called the Thorbecke adage, and it's a fundament on which Dutch cultural policy and other things, but cultural policy is based. And the idea is that the government may support art and science, but it must always remain neutral with regards to its content, with regards to its aesthetic quality. And this is a very important, very central thing in Dutch cultural policy, but it's also a very problematic one, because still the government subsidizes symphony orchestras to a large extent, the professional symphony orchestras, and the government has to make the decisions who gets funding and who doesn't. Even though she doesn't decide on the content, she has an indirect influence on what things are, what content is possible to be made, and what is supported and what is not so much supported. To sort of find a way to say something about what is valuable and what is not, you see a movement ever since the early 2000s that the government focuses on, and we've heard the word before, sort of welfare, prosperity, sort of health, other reasons why culture would be good. But as a consequence of that, you see emerge that that it is more and more important, or deemed important, that cultural institutions such as museums, such as orchestras, stimulate or develop activities that are deemed participatory, that either work towards more diverse audiences, that move into the neighborhood, that are educational, that engage schools, etc., etc. Not to go into this much longer, what I found ultimately was that the notion of participation just stimulates very particular types of activities. It stimulates cultural institutions to develop other activities, new activities, to set up other departments. But at the same time, it also results in messy situations, because the notion of participation results in new activities, and these activities then in turn turn out not to fit so well with the strict divide that the criteria are built on. So, for instance, a participatory concert is both has to be both evaluated on the basis of its artistic content and its social value. But the quality criteria of the government are not done in such a way, are not organized in such a way. Sorry, I'm also okay. Getting messages. Sorry. I'm not used to this Zoom situation anymore. Can you tell? Anyhow, so notion of participation says a lot about the values and the need for the government to find ways to evaluate cultural activities in new ways, but at the same time, it shows that it's a moving target, also in the sense that participation challenges assumptions about quality criteria that have existed for a long time. It creates space in a way for orchestras to try and develop new activities. Having sort of gotten to know participation as this notion that is this moving target that acquires meanings also in the field through new activities that are being developed, I then ethnographically analyzed how 4 different symphony orchestras, the Zuid-Nederlands Philharmonic, so Philharmonie Zuid-Nederland, the Rotterdam Philharmonic Orchestra, the experimental and democratic collective Pinarello, and the amateur orchestra NSO, the Dutch Student Orchestra, how they developed concerts in which they innovated the role of the audience. And what I first researched was what was difficult about this, difficult about changing the role of the audience. And what I found, what that meant that I ended up in lots of situations that were not concerts. So marketing meetings, evaluation meetings, rehearsals, on the floor during a build-up. Because what soon became clear is that in practice, it appears that innovating audience participation requires orchestras to change much more much more than just the role of the audience during the concert. In fact, the innovation of audience participation runs as a red thread through the entire organizational process. Because by changing the role of the audience, even if only subtly, everything starts to shift along the way. So the material infrastructure of concerts has to be rethought. If it's not in a concert hall, things change. If an audience has to walk instead of sit, things materially change. And it goes as far as practically chairs, but also lighting, the organization of a space, the acoustics of a space, etc. Then what also needs to be reconsidered is the very routinized distribution of artistic responsibilities. What does it mean if an audience gets a say in how the music is played during a concert? And for instance, also priorities, what is most important for the concert to come to a good end, need to be reconsidered completely. Every little detail of the process might get a new meaning. It might not, but it has to be considered whether it does or not. And this leads to difficulties in practice, because as in the policy context and building on a sort of existing frame of reference, existing norms and conventions, orchestras are used to making a very strict distinction between, on the one hand, the aesthetic core and the aesthetic quality of their work, and then everything around it. They want to protect what they're doing, and that's understandable, but that's also problematic in a situation in which you don't quite know what the end result will be or will look like or will sound like. So whereas orchestral routines, such as acoustics, for instance, in a concert hall, exist to protect and maintain that standard of aesthetic quality, they are in a way, safety nets that help to keep up the quality of the concert. But in these innovative concerts, they were unreflexively often fallen back onto. And then you saw a practice that actually got stuck in the safety nets that were usually in place, because they were not allowed to change them, to reconsider them, and to create space to reflect on their own organizational process and also take into account what other things emerged along the way. So I found that what was needed was a much more process-oriented approach to organizing concerts, rather than this product-oriented view of we have to at least protect the music itself that will be performed in the end. Because if you keep holding on to that product, then you are holding on to a sort of old process for a new type of concert, which led to very practical issues in the cases I followed. But of course, I didn't only focus on difficulties. Let's end this upbeat. I also analyzed what happens at the, sometimes very small, but still moments that orchestras innovate audience participation and in which new kinds of qualities emerged. As a final empirical step, I went to look then for what kinds of new norms, values also emerged in innovative projects. And what I found there was that during projects that innovated audience participation, the various orchestral practitioners, from musicians to staff, they had to deal with an element, namely the audience, that was no longer known in advance and no longer fixed, which role was under discussion. And it was the responsibility, or it became visible that it's the responsibility of orchestra members to get this audience on board during concerts. The audience in innovative project is a kind of gauge for what a good performance is. And that means that orchestra members, again, from musicians to all kinds of staff members, had to expand on their existing repertoires of skills, of actions, of ideas. They had to learn new practical skills, so presentation skills, acting skills. They had to play their instruments differently than they were used to. In other words, they had to acquire different qualities other than only the musical technical qualities and they became necessary in order to end up with a good concert. These qualities were not external to the project. They were an inherent part of it. They were necessary for the project to be brought to a good end. So on a more fundamental level, this is not only about learning new skills. It was also about innovative projects, and that I showed that in those projects, it can often no longer be known in advance what a good end result means. And therefore, it cannot be known in advance what does or what is or what is not aesthetic work. In other words, what contributes to the aesthetic quality of the concert cannot always be easily defined. Sometimes it turns out that the chairs are aesthetically relevant to the end result of the concert. So that leads to some conclusions, and this is only an overview, of course, but it leads to the insight that audience participation is an inherent part of all the activities of a symphony orchestra. Although at a first glance, it may seem that the audience does not enter orchestral practice until quite late, right? After all the work is done, the concert is subsidized, programmed, rehearsed. But in projects in which audience participation is being innovated, it becomes clear again that the audience, also in regular concerts, is already present throughout the whole process. It is imagined, it is expected, and it is planned socially and materially and aesthetically in very particular ways. And when the role of the audience changes, this leads to unfamiliar situations throughout the whole organizational process that make the aesthetic framework that exists, that everyone in the orchestra knows, rattle. And in policy discourse, the notion of participation we saw leads to tensions. It leads to situations in which existing and clearly defined quality criteria no longer work because they do not fit the projects that are less clearly defined and do not fit within this old framework. So, and it appears that orchestras themselves then, in turn, they have to reflect again and newly on what exactly a good concert is. So in the end, the innovation of audience participation is difficult, is exciting, is important, because it touches upon the identity of the orchestra as an aesthetic organization. It challenges symphony orchestras to question existing standards that guarantee a very specific form of audience aesthetic quality. And these projects show that alternatives are possible. There are more types of concerts possible. And in the bigger Artful Participation project, we then actually got to work on what kinds of alternatives there might be to explore together with Philharmonie uit Nederland, together with the Conservatory of Maastricht. We started working, experimenting and learning in their practices. And Ties will now tell you more about that.
Thank you, Veerle.
Ties takes over.
Yes, quite organically. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ties. I was a postdoc conducting experiments with Philharmonie uit Nederland together with the whole team, and most importantly, Imogen, who's also here. As already Peter and Veerle talked about, that this is a very collaborative project involving universities, but also conservatory, the orchestra. So maybe Veerle can go to the next slide. The idea is that we combined different kinds of research. And for the key question, basically is how can we actually design an experiment with artistically relevant forms of audience participation in the practice of an orchestra? And more importantly, how can we learn from them? And this touches on the problem that Veerle also saw in her research, namely that what is called audience participation is often bracketed off from aesthetics or artistic quality. And we wanted to experiment when in situations when the audience can become artistically relevant and what that would mean. So we did that with different kinds of research, academic research, but also artistic research. And Imogen was the musician researcher with a professional background as a violinist. And together with Imogen and lots of staff and orchestra musicians and the whole team, we created experiments, situations where we actually manipulated a concert situation in order to learn from it. And I think this is an important concept, this idea of innovation and learning, because for us, innovation is not about newness or making something new, but really learning from doing something different. It's a key notion that is from different fields of research that has inspired this project, science technology studies, and especially kind of interventionist research that has been practiced there, builds on the tradition of action research and ethnography, but also, as I said, artistic research, especially the style of artistic research, where the research center in Maastricht, Arts, Autonomy in the Public Sphere, is really well known by him. And if you talk about learning, because it's so central to our research, we worked with 3 different kinds of forms of learning, and there are many more, but 3 ones were important for our project. I'm going to briefly discuss them a little bit. It's a kind of therapeutic learning, you can say. Then you're, as a researcher, you're kind of a critical friend. So you observe concerts and the organization of concerts in an orchestra, and you ask critical questions in order to kind of instill a form of reflection. And basically what you want to do is to make things that remain implicit, ways of working, routines, ideas of what counts as a good concert, to make those explicit, so you can actually also discuss them. This is a very, you could say, traditional form of the researcher as a critical friend who looks from the outside in. Secondly, we also want to do something and actually organizing experiments, where a different form of learning is experienced, namely experimental learning. And this is a form of learning that emerges when you really try to do things differently than you normally would do. So organize differently, rehearse differently, work with different criteria of what counts as a good concert, to give an example. And finally, a third way of learning is a kind of reflexive learning. And this is a kind of learning that is about a kind of more sustainable form, in the sense that it is a really willingness and openness to find new ways of learning, to remain reflexive within your daily work, or at least within the work of the organization, of the orchestra. And why is this important, you could say? Because learning, especially the reflexive learning, is a form of learning that makes you anticipate to the unexpected or to things that deviate. And the moment that you start experimenting, for example, with audience participation, there will always be situations that are unexpected or sometimes even uncertain. And with a kind of reflexivity, that's the skill that helps you navigate those. Okay, we did a lot in this project, and the time is short, so I'm going to briefly discuss 3 experiments we did and some lessons learned. One of the first experiments that we organized and designed is called Maler am Tisch. And in this experiment, groups of musicians from the orchestra work together in ensembles to adapt the work of Mahler, Gustav Mahler, in order to perform it in a bar in Maastricht, actually 2 bars, am Tisch, around the table. That's the idea. And the idea was that we worked with the notion of what is an audience actually, and what could audience participation mean from the eyes and perspective of musicians and the ears of musicians, I should say. And we work with the notion of imagined audiences and emergent audiences. And for, I think, 4 nights in a row, musicians of the orchestra, also together with amateur musicians from local bands, played in 2 bars in Maastricht, works of Mahler especially adopted for that situation. And we, as a whole team, we observed what happened, not only during the rehearsal process, but also during the concerts. So as a researcher, we were in a double role of basically organizing and designing these experiments, and at the same time also documenting them extensively. Some lessons that we learned here is that to make explicit what audience musicians imagine there to be helps during rehearsals to make certain kind of choices. But also that if you deviate from the routines of musicians, for example, in these situations, a musician could no longer rely on routines of rehearsing or performing, and also not conventional criteria for what would be a good performance. And also there were also artistic responsibilities that were now scattered, not fixed with the conductor, for example. So what we learned from that is it can make musicians quite vulnerable in this situation, and you need a lot of care and courage to do this. And also that audience participation, is one lesson learned here, starts with really acknowledging how audience are already present in any musical situation and how they contribute to any musical situation. In the next experiment, it's called the People's Salon. We wanted friends of the orchestra, the Philharmonic Orchestra, South Netherlands, like fans, they have a big fan base. We invited some 12 friends of the orchestra to think along and come up with a programming for a concert evening. So we had interviews with them, we held focus groups with them. And the question that we asked them is, what is your favorite music or composition? And not just favorite in terms of music, but what kind of anecdote or personal story do you have with that part or piece of music? So we basically, together with these friends and the concert programmer, we programmed an evening where the whole program of the evening consisted of personal stories of audience members with their favorite parts of music. And this was a fantastic process, actually, to do this. If you want to do a research with audiences, go sit in their homes and talk to them for hours about their music. That's one of the best memories I have about this project. People can be so open, and it becomes so visible how meaningful music can be for people in their lives. And if you can share that on stage, because we asked these friends to share their story on stage to the other audience members, it really creates a different kind of listening experience also. And it shows, as a lesson that we took from this, that you can artistically, meaningfully involve audiences in the programming, for example. But also that these stories show how classical music can matter for people in different ways, because there were different themes of the stories that people told about their favorite piece. Very daily, mundane stories, but also stories about grief, about consolation and joy, etc. Then COVID broke out, and instead of doing a community arts project with classical musicians in Maastricht, we found ourselves at home. So we turned this experiment into a kind of online experiment, completely different, with the question: what does it take to actually perform classical music online? And how do you perform when the audience is really not present, or your fellow musicians are not even present? So in the first lockdown in the Netherlands in March 2020, we worked with musicians, 5 musicians through Zoom, amongst other, to figure out what digital media affords musicians. And here we basically talked a lot with these musicians. We experimented with all kinds of compositions, making it online, performing it online. But what we learned most is the difficulty of balancing different criteria. For example, and that digital media have different artistic criteria for example, intimacy or directness, or a different kind of authenticity, and how to balance those with, for example, the lack of sound quality or audio quality. But it also shows is producing such a video together showed the kind of stuff that usually remains hidden or natural when musicians perform together in front of audiences, and how you closely play music together in terms of intonation and dynamics, etc. That suddenly became visible. And even more so, the lack of audiences became visible. And imagine, so musicians without audience were compelled to imagine a specific audience for their digital recordings. And that really helped structure the whole process and make decisions. Then finally, so these experiments were forms, you could say, of experimental learning. In the last year of the project, we wanted to know, but how can we take the results and these insights that we have to the rest of the orchestra, because not the entire orchestra obviously was involved in some of these experiments. So for over, I think, almost a year, we worked closely with almost the entire orchestra of Philharmonie Zuid-Nederland. And this is a project experiment we called the Learning Orchestra, where we try to really evoke kind of reflexive learning. And we did this by sharing the experiences, both of research, but also of staff and musicians conducting in these, who participated in these experiments, and invited all the orchestra members, in the end, some 76, I should say, participated in this learning experiment. They all went working together to create kind of exercises, or what we called etudes, for learning. So it's particular skills for learning to do things differently. That varied from rehearsing routines to how do you actually evaluate concerts that deviate from the standard concert. And all these people together created exercises for practicing with it. It was a very inspiring project to do, also because to see how many people were working on this. That was really, I think, super inspiring. Okay, then quickly, maybe to leave also some room for questions. We learned some basic lessons. We learned a lot, much more. I'll show you in a brief moment where you can find that. But some basic key lessons that we learned throughout this project is that audience participation is really not just a marketing thing or a concert format. It really involves how you organize a concert, how you perform it, but also how you evaluate it. And this includes producing it, the production of a concert. We also learned that innovation is about learning, and that this learning really is not without effort or risk or problems. It really takes time, money. So the orchestra, with a very fixed schedule, really had to make time for all these experiments to work, and all the process and meetings, etc., which is really is an effort to do. It also takes, and maybe that's even more important, it takes also courage and care. Courage to really try something different, and while being uncertain what it will become, and also care for the vulnerabilities that arise when doing so. Because if you work from a very cherished tradition and a fixed routine of working, to do something different is challenging, and it really involves care for everyone who tries to do so. And also, if you really want to innovate and to have some sustainable impact, then you cannot stick with one form of learning. Ideally, different forms of learning should take place, and especially the reflexive learning is a very important one. And then finally, I think one of the biggest challenges is all of this learning innovation that we now have told you about needs a kind of focus and care and attention for the process rather than for the output. That means in practice of an orchestra who is super busy and have a tight planning and is focused on performing good concerts, the very process of organizing, evaluation, rehearsing, it takes time to really build ways of attention, I could say, to learn. Okay, maybe for the final slide, we did a lot in this project. So next to these experiments, Imogen wrote a book for conservatory students and teachers, but I think it's super relevant also for other practitioners in the field about doing things differently. VLS PhD is an outcome. We wrote a bunch of articles, but I think one of the most compelling outcomes that we worked on is a website, but it's not just a website. No, this is a kind of curated journey through audience participation. You can visit it at artfulparticipation.nl. And what we did is we showcased our experiments, but we also wanted to tell the story of audience participation from different perspectives. So from the perspective of a programmer of an orchestra, or for an audience member, or for somebody whose task is to innovate it, and the innovator, or from the perspective of a musician. So through these perspectives are kind of journeys into audience participation, what is relevant questions, examples, but also exercises and etudes that you can practice different skills with. And I would like to invite you, as a last note, to check this website. And we're happy to hear what you think of it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ties, and also Veerle, of course, for your presentations. And I think, yeah, we still have time for questions. So the floor is open if you want. Yeah, I see, Gerald, you raised your hand.
Well, yes, I would like to point out a question. Can you estimate how much a concert orchestra should reserve in time, in percentage, on being more, creative? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Where is it?
That is a good question. Well, that's a really good question. I don't know if Stefan is in the audience. Maybe he has a better view on this. But if you look at, okay, let me try to build it down. I mean, it depends on how rehearsal time, for example, is also scheduled. But I think, yeah, there are many meetings because, for example, if you organize a concert with friends or audience members, then you can't just sit there on your own as a programmer or with your team and devise a concert, but you really have like many meetings with audience members. So then it would extend a lot. But in the basic, I think also your question relates to how can you instill some reflexive learning in the day-to-day business of an orchestra. I think, yeah, I don't know what percentage, but it should be more than often is the case.
Well, I can add a bit to that. I think it's a wonderful question. I hadn't looked at it like that, but I see Anna who says in the chat 100%. And to kind of react to that, the thing is that I think the difficulty with innovative projects is that it tends to become like this separate pillar, just like education projects. So that we do the regular ones, and then next to that we do the education ones, and then we need to reserve some time to do the innovative ones. Whereas if we take the findings in our project seriously, I think I would say that rather than having like every Wednesday afternoon for innovative projects, you would almost need to add like an X amount of time to every phase of every project to be able to guarantee. And sometimes you might not need the time and the space, but sometimes you will need it. And then it has to be reserved beforehand, because you cannot predict in which project there will be complex situations emerging in what stage, whether that be at the marketing department, at the rehearsal, during the build-up. So I would say that it would be like an add-on time to every activity. Just counting a bit more time for every part of the organizational process might work better than having like a separate block of time reserved to do the innovative thing, because only then it can become an inherent part, an integrated part of the organization as a whole.
And then they also can learn from what's already there, because that's also one of the findings. There's a lot of expertise already exists about doing things differently in an orchestra, but sometimes it's like compartmentalized. So to look at innovation and learning as an integral part of your organization, then you make that at least also visible and shareable.
Yeah, thanks for your responses. Any other questions? I see a hand, Adrian.
Hello, yes, thanks so much for the presentations. They were really interesting. Veerle mentioned something about performers needing special qualities in order to perform effectively in unconventional formats. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you think those are and how performers can be educated and trained to develop those skills, and when when that can happen, especially if it hasn't been part of their formal educational training to date. I think performers can be quite resistant to adapting how they approach performance.
Yeah, thank you. That is, I mean, that's a crucial question. And I think you also rightly point out that, or hint towards the fact that this should probably start long before the musicians start working at the orchestra on their fixed contract. So there's a huge task for conservatories there. And actually Imogen, who's here, she might want to say something about that because she actually worked with conservatory students on these questions. But to quickly react to your question when it comes to my research, because I did study orchestras, of which some people had more of an education perhaps in these kind of things than others. But what the reality of, at least in the Netherlands, of Dutch symphony orchestras is that the same group of musicians will do both the innovative concerts and the education concerts, and they will do, you know, a regular concert and an educational concert in the same week, basically. And I think that is where a huge opportunity is, in the sense that in educational concerts, there's a lot more space for musicians and a lot more willingness as well, generally speaking, to learn other things. And then I'm speaking about very practical things, about giving a good presentation or introduction, talking to a group of children, playing your horn while laying on your back on the ground because it's necessary for the scene. These are like, these seem like small things, but it's more about this prepared openness, this preparedness to learn a new thing if it's necessary for the concert as a whole, I would say. So I would not necessarily advocate for like a strict sort of set of skills that every musician needs to learn, but rather it's another attitude almost, I would say. And then not everyone can learn everything, and I think that's absolutely fine, but that's also part of this process, learning to see what suits you and what not, and what suits you as a musician and what does not. That's how I would respond to that. But maybe, I don't know, Imogen, maybe you would like to contribute. You can also say no, because I know you're here as an audience member.
I can a bit if you want, but I'm not sure if you can hear me okay. I'm gonna, yeah. Well, I think Phil is right in the sense that attitude is kind of the main thing, and particularly attitude about the notion of a work and so on, and being very attached to that, as we know, can make flexibility limited. But I suppose I would say that there are some things that can help. Like I do think a general theatre training in conservatories is useful to have, to kind of build in that openness. Learning to play by ear, that kind of thing. Sorry, is my audio going out? Yeah.
We can still hear
okay.
you.
Anyway, so that kind of thing can help. Okay, yeah. So I think learning to play by ear helps to build flexibility and to remove a bit from the score. So that's kind of a concrete step that I just think can help to remove that slightly. And you see in Pinarello, who I also played with, that's just playing from heart and playing by memory. Already there can be quite a lot of challenges, but that's something that's just kind of necessary and is a very practical step that can help to build flexibility. Doing improv training in theatre can just help to get you out of yourself and to encounter the new and get over those early embarrassments. That is actually the forefront of most resistance when it comes down to it. It's just often discomfort and embarrassment. If you kind of push past that a bit, you're already going to be more open. And those tiny little things, I think, would go so much farther than my pet irritation of improv classes. I think improvisation is really important, but there's a lot of emphasis on that now. And I actually don't think as a solution to these sorts of problems, and I don't actually always think it is the only solution to these sorts of problems, because I think it still focuses so much on the instrument. But that's a different question. But yeah, there's some of the thoughts that I would have about that.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Asja, I see your hand raised.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you? You can. Okay, great. Actually, yes, first of all, also wanted to thank for the lecture because I really enjoyed this information that showed us very diverse and very active ways of involving the audience. And that's why my question is about this old-fashioned way of creating the openness, creating the readiness to perceive music. I mean lecture direction, you know, this entrance note, the kind of preparing people, you know, to dive into the music, in a deeper way maybe than just seeing how it goes and having no idea of what actually can go on. So maybe you collected some information about it because you didn't use it in your project. I assume that you kind of maybe opposed your approach to it, or you somehow integrated it but on different level. Maybe you can mention first of all, what is your attitude to this old-fashioned way? Do you see some potential there? And maybe you can tell a bit about it. Because if I understood you correctly, you tried to change the system from the inside, either to change the music itself by adopting it to people, I mean this arrangement of modern music, or changing the process on every phase. But this option is about changing the attitude, changing the preparation phase, but preserving the music and the process as is. So do you find it a bit maybe weak or not strong enough? So what is your attitude towards it? Thank you very much.
Who wants to take that question?
Shall I try?
Yeah.
Thank you, Asha. It's a good question. And when we were doing the Learning Orchestra, there was a group of musicians in the orchestra who was working on this very thing, like how can we give a digital introduction, for example, but also the question of what is actually an introduction to what. So in response to your question, I'm not opposed to anything. I think they can work really well. The question is rather, you don't need to preserve to give you can also, the question is also, what is a good introduction? Is it only about knowledge of the composer and the work? Or like we did in one of the projects, we had a program booklet, which did not list biographies of the composer, but rather the stories of the audience and why that particular music they cared for it and why it mattered. So I'm not opposed, of course, not to these kind of things, but you can extend them much more. You could even integrate audiences in these digital introductions. For example, by letting them talk about how this music matters to them.
Yeah, thanks. Is that an answer? Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, Gerald, I see your hand.
Not a real question, just a contribution and an observation, again, from the Staatsphilharmonie Ludwigshafen. Because, well, from my perspective, it's one of the most innovative orchestras in Germany these days. And they developed something like a laboratory which observes from different branches of the orchestra the development and takes all the innovative ideas within it. So usually you have a labor committee, or you have a board of musicians, and you have all your institutions within an orchestra organization. But this laboratory is something like, okay, one from the marketing department, from program making, one from the orchestra, one from the ticketing. So a small group of maybe 5 or 6 people who is regularly meeting one time a month and taking all the things and the thoughts together which have been brought up in the last 4 weeks. And so they are steadily laborative working group who takes all the good ideas in its think tank. And I think this is a very good idea, because very often you have a good idea and you bring it up to the management say, oh, now the idea, and you never hear again. And so the point is how to involve these ideas which come from the institutions, because all the people doing their jobs in the marketing, in the orchestra, they know their score. But how bring these things together? And I think this idea of a laboratory, which really works on these issues and contributes again and gives feedback, is so important to bring these things together. And this is, from my perspective, a very good model to bring things together and forward.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and that's, I would say, also something we experienced in the Learning Orchestra experiment, where the people in the orchestra, but also the staff, said we know too little of each other's work, and there is too little communication between all these pillars within the orchestra. And one of the ways the orchestra has tried to cope with that is to have an innovation group. I mean, it sounds a little bit like your laboratory idea. But I think it's a really good point. And that's definitely also one of the outcomes of our project, is that it's incredibly important to have these departments talking to each other and learning from each other, basically. Okay, it is 2 o'clock, and I know that Veerle has to run to catch a train at 2:30. So I want to thank you, Veerle, and also Thies, for the presentations. Thank you all for joining us in this session. And for those who are interested in a coffee break, so in 15 minutes, we have a Zoom link. It's on the list of your Zoom links at the end of the first day, where you can meet other people if you want. But I can also imagine that you just want to go outside or look somewhere into the distance instead of at your screen. So thanks again for joining, and see you hopefully in an hour.